Professor Rooduijn, thank you very much for your time. I want to start with the first question. How would you characterize the key features of populist radical right movements, both in Western Europe and generally, and specifically in the Dutch political landscape? In your analysis, how do these features manifest in the context of Geert Wilders' political ideology? And what social and political factors have contributed to the rise and sustained presence of populist radical right parties in the Netherlands?
So to start with the first, it's more about the definition of the populist radical right, right?
Right.
For me, I follow Cas Mudde's definition, and he basically says that the core feature of radical right parties is their nativism, which is an exclusionary form of nationalism, and it basically means that that parties focus on the nation as such, and that they argue that elements or people which are not compatible with the nation, according to them, forms a threat to the nation. And that's like, it could express itself in many different forms. In, for instance, in anti-Semitism, in Islamophobia, in anti-immigration attitudes, in racism. So these are all different types of in-group, out-group thinking, where the nation is the in-group and others are the out-group. And that is the core of the radical right. And then radical right parties are also authoritarian in that they want their society to be ordered in a very strict way. So and people who break the law should be punished severely according to this approach. So that's the core of the radical right. And these parties are also populist, which means that they emphasize that the good people, the ordinary citizens, are betrayed or corrupted or ignored by an evil elite. And this elite can be a political elite. It often is a political elite, but could also be a cultural elite or a media elite or all kinds of elites, basically. But this populism is often also part of this of the program of these populist radical right parties. And Geert Wilders' party is a prototypical example of such a party. And what really distinguishes his party, I think, from other parties is that he has a very strong anti-Islam component in his program, more so even than the other radical right parties in Europe. So I think that for me would be the core of the populist radical right and also the core of Geert Wilders' program.
Right. Considering the international context, are there similarities or differences between the populist radical right movements in the Netherlands, led by figures like Geert Wilders, and those in other European countries?
Yeah, so there are many similarities and also many differences, right? So the type of leader, for instance, really differs from country to country. Geert Wilders is a very different politician compared to Marine Le Pen, or compared to Matteo Salvini, or compared to Giorgia Meloni. They're really different from each other in many ways. What they have in common is of course, their ideology. And of course, then when it comes to circumstances, economic circumstances differ, party systems differ, media differ. But what I think most of these countries have in common is that there is this fertile breeding ground for success for these parties. So in all these countries in Europe, in Western Europe, but also beyond, there is a relatively large share of the electorate that that is relatively right-wing on cultural issues, that want more restrictive immigration policies, for instance, and also often combined with a general feeling of discontent with politics. And that is something that is present in all European countries. And the success of the populist radical right really depends on the extent to which populist radical right parties manage to translate these feelings and this discontent in actually appealing to these voters and actually convincing them to vote for them. So there is this large, so to say, segment of the population that is at least that is a potential voter for the populist radical right. But what really differs is to what extent politicians manage to seduce these voters. And that also depends on wider context characteristics. For instance, what the media talk and write about, what the other parties do, things like that. So it really also depends on the circumstances to what extent these parties are really successful.
All right. Can you discuss any notable shifts or developments in the public perception of populist radical right ideologies in the Netherlands, particularly in relation to Geert Wilders and his Party for Freedom, PVV, and how have these shifts influenced their electoral performance?
Yeah, so it's more, so you ask me about the way in which voters and maybe parties and media perceive him and how that has changed over the years. Yeah, so I would say that in general, the rhetoric of the far right has been normalized to quite some extent in the Netherlands, but not only in the Netherlands, also in other countries. So what we see is, for instance, in 2002, we had also a right-wing populist politician, Pim Fortuyn. Yeah, and he was fiercely criticized for being very radical, and he was also considered an extremist according to some people. But if you now compare what he said 20 years ago to what Geert Wilders says right now, Pim Fortuyn was relatively moderate. So this indicates to what extent the general discourse in our country has moved, has changed, and has moved towards the radical right. We also have several academic studies showing that not only in the Netherlands but also in other countries, that the election programs of mainstream right parties have moved towards the radical right. They have not become radical right parties, but they have moved into that direction. And the same is true for the general discourse when it comes to immigration and when it comes to identity issues. So I think that, so when it comes to how we talk about topics that are relevant to the radical right, there has been a shift towards the radical right. And then what has happened now, and in particular during this campaign, is that Wilders has also been presented by the other parties actively or in a more passive way as someone who is part of the parties that can be negotiated with. So he has for 10 years or so he has been excluded by the mainstream right. But that has changed during this election campaign because the mainstream right party did open the door to a possible collaboration with Wilders in a government coalition. So that has also helped to normalize his PVV party. So I think both the ideas of the far right have been normalized, but also the party of Wilders itself. So there is, we can really say, I think, that there is normalization of the far right going on in the Netherlands, but also beyond.
All right, okay. Geert Wilders and his Party for Freedom are often associated with anti-immigration policies. Could you provide insights into how his stance on immigration fits into the broader populist radical right narrative in the Netherlands?
Yeah, so when it comes to Geert Wilders, I think his core issue is Islam. So so he is very Islamophobic. So he wants to forbid the Quran, Islamic schools, and he is really headscarf. So it's really that is really his core issue, and has always been almost always been his core issue. Combined now also with asylum and immigration in general. And I think this is what really sets him apart. It's also what distinguishes Wilders from other far-right parties in the Netherlands. So, for instance, we have Forum for Democratie of Thierry Baudet. This party has also this nativist ideology, but it's not focusing on Islam that much. The same is true for Ja 21, Yes 21. Also a populist radical right party, but also this party is not focusing on Islam that much. What is interesting when it comes to Wilders' election victory is that during the campaign, he has argued that Islam was not of core importance to him. So he said that right now, immigration and housing are issues that were more important to him. At the same time, he also said that Islam is still part of the DNA of the party, and he has never taken back anything from his election program, which is really clear about how he thinks about Islam. So I would say that when we say that nativism is the core component of the ideology of the populist radical right, Wilders' specific form or type of nativism is Islamophobia, combined with more general negative attitudes about immigration and asylum.
All right. How does the relationship between civilizational populism and nationalism play out in the context of Wilders' political discourse? And to what extent does it resonate with the Dutch public?
What was the question? So what was the first part? His form of...
The relationship between civilizational populism and nationalism play out...
I didn't get the first part of the question.
I repeat, it's how does the relationship between civilizational populism and nationalism play out in the context of Wilders' political discourse?
Yeah, so how his nationalism plays out in his political discourse is basically...
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, I think his nationalism, how it plays out is basically, most importantly, his the way in which he thinks about Islam, right? And also the way he thinks about asylum and immigration, and that he wants to keep the doors closed, and that he wants the doors to be closed, the borders to be closed. And I think that is most importantly how his specific form of exclusionary nationalism plays out in his specific program, focusing right on Islam and focusing on Muslims, on headscarves, and everything that is related to Islam. And again, during this election, he emphasized it less strongly during the campaign, but it's still part of his election program, and it's still part, as he calls it, his DNA.
How has the relationship between populism and Euroscepticism play out in Dutch politics, particularly within the context of populist radical right movements?
Yes, so you see that most radical right parties are also Eurosceptic. It might be argued that there are some radical right actors now who are less Eurosceptic, but who argue that Europe should be defended against others, right? So it's not really Euroscepticism, but Euroscepticism has been part of the programs of almost all of the radical right party in at least Western Europe, also for Wilders. And he combined, and it's basically a combination of like resistance to European elites, technocrats in Brussels that basically destroy our Dutch identity, and that make that we cannot decide for ourselves. That's also one of the main arguments. So it's both a cultural thing, right? Then it's about identity, and Brussels basically destroys our identity. It's a political argument where we do not, or basically Brussels takes away our power, the power we as citizens have over what we think is important. And third, it also has an economic dimension where he argues that way too much money is flowing to other countries. So that's all part of this Eurosceptic discourse. And in his program, it also says that he is in favor of an exit, right, of the Netherlands leaving the EU. All the other parties with which he is negotiating right now do not want that. So that's never going to happen. And I think he's going to give in there if he's going to be part of a government coalition. But still, it's interesting that this very hard form of Euroscepticism is part of his election program, much more so than many other far-right parties in Europe.
All right. Can you discuss the role of social media and communication strategies in the success and visibility of populist radical right parties in the Netherlands?
Yeah, that I'm know much less about, because I haven't really studied social media. Of course, Geert Wilders is very active on Twitter, or on X, I have to say right now. But he, to what extent social media have really helped him, I don't know. In general, one could say that social media offer populist politicians a way to directly communicate with their voters, and that is what you see. What is happening with Wilders? He has a very loyal and large segment of the population that is following him, and he can communicate with them directly, and that is something that has really changed, right, in the last 20 years or so, that way of communicating with voters. So that is important to him. But to what extent social media have now, during this election campaign, really played a role in his success, I don't know yet.
Can you explain what happened on the night of November 22nd in terms of populism in the Netherlands, populism in Europe, and populism across the globe?
Well, the 22nd of November was, of course, the elections in the Netherlands, right? So that was, and the question, of course, then is what it means for the rest of, well, first for the Netherlands, and then for Europe and the rest of the world. I think what we have seen in the Netherlands is that how rapidly things can change. So it was not predicted a couple of weeks ago that Geert Wilders was going to win the elections. So things have really changed in the last week or so of the election campaign. That is something that we have learned. What we now know is that 1 in 4 Dutch voters can vote for a populist radical right party. That is something new, that this party family can be so big. It's even bigger if you also include the other radical right parties. And it's also interesting that we now know that many voters for instance, the conservative liberals have now voted for the PVV. So they have very much increased their voter base. I don't think that it's likely that these voters will stay with the PVV. We know that many of them have voted for the PVV for strategic reasons. So it's also likely that they will disappear again. But nonetheless, we now have this victory of the far right. And now it's going to be very interesting how it's going to play out when it comes to forming a government coalition. And it's really impossible at this stage to say what is going to happen, because we just don't know. There are no clear rules, and many possible scenarios can play out now. So we really don't know what that means. Of course, I mean, it has also what has happened here has consequences for other countries. In particular, if Geert Wilders is going to be part of government, and if he's going to be a prime minister, that will have consequences for the Netherlands and international relations, and also for maybe for how mainstream parties in other European countries will deal with populist radical right parties. That could have consequences. And of course, it is like it is good news for these populist radical right parties across the globe when one of them is very successful. At the same time, when it comes to elections, we also know that in most countries it's really the topics and the issues that are important to voters themselves at the national stage. They play a very important role. So it's really in the Netherlands, at least, and I think also in other countries, elections are to a large extent about what is going on in national politics, and not so much in international politics. But what is going to be really interesting now is what is going to happen during the European elections in June, because of course we know that many populist radical right parties are doing really well in the polls, and also at elections in the Netherlands. In other countries, not, right? So in Poland and Spain, they did not perform as well as some had expected. But we will see. I mean, I think it's important that we realize that this has happened in the Netherlands. At the same time, it's just one moment in time, and the election could have also gone in a different way, if just some minor things in the campaign were different, right? So it's really like also one moment in time that we have that this has happened.
About the European Parliament elections, how concerned are you that there will be a surge, a victory of populist parties in Europe?
I mean, it is, of course, they are polling well, and many voters, and we know that there are many voters who feel attracted to these parties. I think what is most problematic when you look at their ideas is that several of them are not compatible with liberal democracy when it comes to minority rights, when it comes to checks and balances, when it comes to pluralism, when it comes to freedom of the media, for instance. And that is, I think, really problematic. And what can happen, we have seen that in Europe, we have seen it in Hungary and in Poland. We also have seen it in other countries. And I think when populist radical right parties have a lot of influence and are the most powerful actor in a government, it could have very negative consequences for liberal democracy. And that is something I think we should be worried about.
All right. What impact has the populist radical right had on the overall political discourse and policy agenda in Netherlands? How it has influenced the mainstream political parties? Or can we safely say that PVV has now been a mainstream party and its discourse on immigration, the Moroccans, Islam, and the EU has been mainstream as well?
Yeah, so what I said before, right? So mainstream parties have incorporated their discourse to quite some extent, and also the media. What I said about Pim, right? What he said is now relatively mainstream. So in that way, the discourse of the far right has been normalized, and mainstream parties have also legitimized what populist radical right parties argue. But I don't think that we should say that that the populist radical right has become more mainstream in that sense, because that suggests that they have become more moderate, and that's not the case. It's the other way around. Mainstream parties have become more radical, because we know that if we look over time, all these populist radical right parties in Europe, they have stayed, that they're just as radical as they have ever been. I mean, Geert Wilders had a more moderate image during these elections, but his election program was as radical as ever. If you look at Marine Le Pen in France, her normalization campaign has worked, and she is seen by many as being more moderate than her father. But if you just look at the election program, the Rassemblement National is still a very populist radical right party. So these parties have not really moderated their core ideology. If they have moderated, what is moderated is more the way in which they present themselves, their style, if you want, but not the core elements of their political programs.
All right. In your view, what are the main challenges faced by populist radical right movements in maintaining long-term political relevance, and how has Wilders navigated these challenges in the Dutch political context?
So the question is what the challenges for these parties themselves are.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So I think for Wilders, I think the main challenge he faces right now is that although many people have voted for him, his party still has a stigma, and many politicians don't want to be associated with the PVV. And for him now, it is really difficult to find personnel, to find candidates for political jobs. So, for instance, he had 45 people on his list, but and 37 of them are elected right now. So he only has 8 spare people. If people are going to be ministers, going to go to government, it is possible that he will not have enough people to replace them. So it is really, and also we already saw that it is really difficult for him to find people who can become a minister or play an important political role, because many people just don't want to be associated with him and with the PVV. So personnel is really difficult for him, also because he's of course, he doesn't have a member party, right? He's the only member of his party, and he has difficulties trusting people, trusting his colleagues in the PVV as well. So that is going to be a major issue for him to find good personnel, even after, 17 years that he is in politics right now.
And lastly, Professor Rooduijn, you counted anti-Semitism as one of the basic features of populist right-wing parties in Europe. But in Geert Wilders, we don't see it. He's very pro-Israeli. How do we explain that?
Yeah, it's not, anti-Semitism is not necessarily part of their program. What is part of their program is nativism. And nativism can also express itself in a different way, right? It can express itself as anti-Semitism, but also as Islamophobia. And that is how it is expressed in Wilders' a specific context. So what nativism is more a general way of thinking about in-group, out-group thinking. It is about the nation versus dangerous others. And when we talk about anti-Semitism, the dangerous others are Jews, right? But when we talk about Islamophobia, in Geert Wilders' case, the dangerous others are Muslims, or as he argues, Islam as an extremist ideology. That is how he calls it. So anti-Semitism is a form in which nativism can express itself, but for Wilders, he is not anti-Semitic. He is Islamophobic. So that's a different form of nativism, a different way in which his nativism expresses itself, if you will.
All right. Professor Rooduijn, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.